Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into an emotional story that will leave you breathless. What would you do if you woke up after giving birth, only to find your baby fighting for life in silence? Stay with me to uncover what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. When Tieu Lac opened her eyes, the world didn't return all at once. It came back slowly, in fragments, the faint hum of machines, the sterile scent of the hospital, the distant sound of footsteps moving past the room. And then, pain. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but deep, heavy, like her body had gone through something it wasn't ready to remember yet. She blinked once, then again, her vision slowly focused. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, white, cold, still. She tried to move her hand. It felt weak, but it moved, and instinctively, it went to her belly. Her fingers froze, flat. The absence hit her before any words could. Her breathing changed immediately, faster, shallow. Her eyes widened slightly as panic began to rise. "My baby." The words barely came out, a whisper, broken. The door opened. The CEO stepped in. The moment he saw her awake, he stopped. Relief flashed across his face, quick, bright. But it didn't stay, because the next second, he saw her eyes, searching, terrified. "Where is the baby?" Silence, just 1 second. But it was enough. Tieu Lac's fingers tightened around the blanket. "Where is my baby?" Her voice rose slightly this time, not loud, but desperate. The CEO walked toward her quickly. He didn't sit. He didn't reach for her immediately, as if he didn't know how. "The baby is here." His voice was controlled, careful, but something in it wasn't right. Tieu Lac felt it instantly. Then why isn't the baby here? Her eyes locked onto his, demanding, afraid. He finally sat down beside her, slowly, as if every movement required effort. "The baby is in the neonatal room." The words were clear, but heavy. "She's weak." The room went silent, not empty, but suffocating. Tieu Lac stared at him. Her mind tried to catch up. Weak. What did that mean? How weak? Why? Her breathing became uneven. "No." Her head shook slowly. "No, you said everything would be okay." Her voice cracked, not loud, but breaking. The CEO reached for her hand this time, gently, but she pulled it back, not in anger, in fear. What happened? The question came out sharper now, stronger, because she needed the truth, even if it hurt. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. They had to deliver early. Her heart dropped. They said the stress, the pressure, it affected the baby. Each word felt heavier than the last. "They're monitoring her. The doctor said we have to wait." Wait. That word, again, always wait. Tieu Lac turned her face away. Tears slipped quietly into her hair. "I did this." The whisper was almost inaudible, but he heard it, immediately. "No." His voice came firm this time, but still low. "This is not your fault." She shook her head again. "It is." Her fingers curled into the blanket. "I knew something was wrong. I felt it. And I still... Her voice disappeared, because the thought finished itself. Too late. The CEO didn't argue again. He just stayed there. Because sometimes words don't help. They only make the silence louder. The neonatal room was quiet, too quiet. Machines hummed softly, monitors blinked with small, steady lights, and inside a transparent incubator, a tiny figure lay almost motionless. So small, so fragile, that it didn't feel real. The CEO stood still at the doorway. He had prepared himself, or at least, he thought he had. But nothing prepares you for this. Not the size, not the stillness, not the way something so small can carry so much fear. A nurse approached quietly. "You can come closer." He nodded, but his steps were slow. Careful, as if walking too fast might break something invisible. He stopped beside the incubator and looked down. The baby's chest moved, barely. A small rise, a small fall, so faint that if he blinked, he might miss it. His hand lifted instinctively, then stopped mid-air. He didn't touch the glass, didn't dare. What did the doctor say?" His voice was lower than usual, rough. The nurse spoke gently. "The baby was born early. Her lungs are not fully developed yet." A pause. "But she's fighting." Fighting, such a big word, for something so small. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't move. Not even for a second. Because in that moment, everything else disappeared. No company, no family, no past, no future, only this, only her. Tieu Lac insisted on seeing the baby, even though the doctor advised rest, even though her body wasn't ready, even though every step hurt. "I need to see her." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't leave space for refusal. The CEO didn't argue, he just helped her up. Carefully, every movement slow, measured. Because now, nothing could be rushed. When she reached the neonatal room, she stopped. Just before the door, her hand tightened around his. "I'm scared." The words were honest, raw. He looked at her, then gently squeezed her hand. "I'm here." It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. It wasn't reassurance. It was something simpler. Presence. Together. They stepped inside, and then she saw her. The world went silent. Completely. Tieu Lac didn't cry immediately. She didn't speak. She just stared. At the tiny body, at the wires, at the small chest rising and falling, so weak, so fragile, and something inside her broke. "My baby." Her voice trembled. She moved closer, slowly, like she was afraid even her presence might be too much. "She's so small." The words came out in pieces. Her hand lifted toward the glass, stopped, then rested there, lightly, as if that thin layer was the only thing holding everything together. "Why is she like this?" No one answered. Because there was no answer that could make it easier. The CEO stood beside her, silent, his eyes never leaving the baby. Hours passed, without them noticing. They didn't eat, didn't rest, didn't leave. They just stood there, watching, waiting, hoping. Every small movement from the baby became everything. Every slight change felt like a sign, good or bad. They didn't know. They just knew. They couldn't look away. Late that night, outside the hospital corridor, the CEO finally stepped away for a moment, just a moment. He pulled out his phone. His fingers hesitated, then dialed. The call connected quickly. "Sir?" It was his assistant. "I need a specialist." His voice was calm but urgent. "The best neonatal doctor in the city." A pause. "Have them here by tomorrow." The assistant didn't question. "Yes, sir. I'll arrange it immediately." He ended the call, stood there for a second, then leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Because for the first time, he felt it. Not pressure, not responsibility, but helplessness. The kind that no amount of power could fix. The next morning, the news traveled faster than expected. The call, the doctor, the urgency. It didn't stay quiet. It reached places he didn't intend it to. And eventually, it reached her, the CEO's mother. She stood in her quiet, elegant living room, phone still in hand, her expression unreadable. The baby is in critical condition. The person on the other end hesitated. "Yes, madam." Silence, long, cold. Then, "And Tieu Lac?" "She is at the hospital." Another pause, then she slowly sat down. her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, her eyes distant, thinking, calculating, or perhaps feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. No one knew, but one thing was certain: she had heard. And when she heard, she would not stay still. Back at the hospital, Tieu Lac hadn't moved. Not really. She sat beside the incubator now, her eyes red, but dry, because she had cried until there were no tears left. Her hand still resting lightly against the glass, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to stay." A pause. "You have to come back to me." The baby didn't respond, but her chest still moved, small, faint, alive. The CEO stood behind her, watching both of them. His hand slowly came to rest on her shoulder, gentle, steady. But even that touch felt fragile, because deep down, they both knew this wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere far away, a decision was already being made, one that could change everything, again. Morning came, but it didn't feel like a new day. Nothing had changed. Not really. The machine still hummed with the same quiet rhythm. The light still blinked in soft, indifferent patterns. And inside the incubator, the baby still lay there, small, fragile, fighting. Tieu Lac hadn't slept, not even for a moment. Her body was exhausted, still recovering, still weak, but her eyes refused to close. Every time they did, even for a second, fear rushed in. Fear that when she opened them again, something would be gone. So she stayed awake, watching, waiting, holding on to every tiny movement like it was everything. The CEO stood a few steps behind her, speaking in low tones with a doctor who had just arrived, one of the specialists flown in from the city. The doctor reviewed the reports, the scans, the monitors. His expression remained professional, calm, but serious. "Her lungs are underdeveloped," he said quietly. "That's expected with premature birth. But the real concern," he paused, "the stress during pregnancy." The CEO's jaw tightened. "We've stabilized her for now," the doctor continued, "but the next 48 hours are critical." Critical. That word again. The CEO nodded slowly. "Do whatever you need to do." The doctor looked at him. "We will." A pause. "But you need to prepare yourself. This is not something we can control completely." The CEO didn't respond, because he already knew that, and knowing it didn't make it easier. Tieu Lac didn't hear the conversation. Or maybe she did. But her mind couldn't hold on to it, because her entire world had narrowed down to one thing: the small rise and fall of that tiny chest. She leaned closer to the glass, her voice soft, almost like a lullaby. "You said you would stay with me." Her fingers traced the surface lightly. "We haven't even met yet." A tear finally slipped down, slow, silent. "You can't leave like this." Behind her, the CEO took a step forward, then stopped, because he didn't know what to say. There was no sentence that could hold this moment together, so he stayed quiet and let her speak, because sometimes hope sounds like a whisper. Around noon, footsteps echoed in the corridor, different from before, more deliberate, more controlled. The kind that didn't belong to doctors or nurses rushing between rooms. The CEO turned his head, and immediately his expression changed. At the end of the hallway, his mother stood, elegant as always, composed, unshaken, as if she hadn't just stepped into a place filled with fear. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded. No one spoke, but the air shifted, heavy, tense, unavoidable. She walked forward slowly, each step measured. Her gaze moved past him and settled on Tieu Lac, sitting there, still, unmoving, her hand against the glass, her world reduced to a single fragile life. The CEO stepped forward slightly. "Why are you here?" His voice was low, guarded. She didn't look at him immediately. I heard. A simple answer, but it carried everything. A pause. Then, I wanted to see. The CEO's jaw tightened. This isn't the place, but she raised her hand, stopping him. Just like before. Then she continued walking until she stood beside Tieu Lac, close enough to see everything, the baby, the machines, the fragile line between life and loss. For the first time, her expression changed. Just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough. Because what she saw was not what she expected. Not a lie, not a scheme, not a calculated attempt to climb into their world, but something else entirely, something raw, something painful, something real. Tieu Lac didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge her presence, not out of disrespect, but because she couldn't. She didn't have anything left to give to anyone else. Not right now. Her entire being was here, with her child. You should rest. The older woman's voice was softer than before, still controlled, but different. Tieu Lac didn't respond. She only shook her head slightly. I can't. A pause. She needs me. The CEO's mother looked at her, long, carefully. Then her eyes shifted to the baby again, the tiny chest, the small movement, the fight. Something in her gaze shifted, quietly, unnoticeably, but it was there. The doctor approached again, speaking with the nurse, adjusting something, checking the monitor. Then, a slight change in the sound. Not loud, but different. The rhythm. Tieu Lac noticed immediately. Her body tensed. What's wrong? Her voice came out quickly, too quickly. The nurse moved closer. Her breathing is unstable. The words landed, heavy, immediate. Tieu Lac's fingers pressed harder against the glass. No! The CEO stepped forward. What does that mean? The doctor's voice remained calm. We need to assist her breathing more aggressively. More machines, more tubes, more intervention. Each step necessary, each step terrifying. Tieu Lac's breathing became uneven. Her body trembled slightly. She's getting worse. No one answered directly, because the answer was already there, in the urgency, in the movement, in the way the room changed in seconds. The CEO reached for her, but she didn't move, didn't step back, didn't blink. She just stared, as if looking away would break something. The CEO's mother stood still, watching everything, the chaos, the urgency, the reality. And for the first time, she wasn't outside of it. She was in it. And there was no control here, no status, no power, no influence. Just a child, fighting, and a mother, breaking. Tieu Lac's voice came again, barely holding together. Please. She didn't know who she was speaking to. The doctor, the world, anyone. Please save her. The room fell into that strange silence again, the kind that only exists in moments where everything is on the edge. The CEO stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, but even he felt it. That helplessness again, stronger this time, because now there was no distance, no delay. It was happening, right here, right now. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time no longer made sense. The machines continued, the doctors worked, and slowly, the sound stabilized. Just slightly, not safe, not certain. But while holding, the doctor finally stepped back. We've managed to support her breathing for now. Tieu Lac's legs nearly gave out. The CEO caught her instantly. Easy. She nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving the incubator. Is she okay? The doctor didn't answer right away. Then, she's still fighting. That word again, fighting. But this time, it felt different. Because now they had seen it. How close it could come. How quickly things could change. How fragile everything truly was. Later that evening, the room was quieter again. Tieu Lac sat back down, weaker, but still there, still watching, the CEO stood beside her, and behind them, his mother, still silent. Then she stepped forward, slowly, and for the first time, her voice came, different, lower. "She looks like you." Tieu Lac froze, just for a second, because those words, they weren't doubt, they weren't judgment, they were recognition. The CEO looked at his mother, surprised, but didn't speak. Tieu Lac swallowed, her voice barely steady. "She's yours too." A long silence followed. Then, the older woman didn't argue, didn't deny. She simply stood there, looking at the child, at the fragile life she once questioned, and something inside her shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. That night, the storm didn't come from outside. It had already passed through them, left something behind, something fragile, but real. Tieu Lac leaned back slightly, exhausted, her head resting gently against the chair. The CEO stood beside her, his hand never leaving her shoulder, and for the first time, his mother didn't stand apart. She stayed, close, watching, not as someone judging from a distance, but as someone who had finally stepped into the same reality. No words were needed, because in that quiet moment, they all understood the same thing. Life doesn't wait for acceptance, it forces it, and sometimes it takes everything to finally see what truly matters. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the machines continued their quiet rhythm, and in the fragile space between breath and silence, one small life kept fighting. But the question remained, would that be enough? Or was this only the beginning of something even harder to face? Tieu Lac wakes up after giving birth, only to discover that her baby is too weak to stay by her side and must be placed in intensive care. The fragile newborn struggles to breathe, leaving both Tieu Lac and the CEO overwhelmed with fear and guilt. Refusing to leave the baby even for a moment, they stay by the incubator, watching every small movement as if it could decide everything. Desperate, the CEO calls in top specialists from the city, hoping to save their child. However, this decision brings unexpected consequences when his mother learns the truth and arrives at the hospital. As tension rises, she witnesses the baby's condition and Tieu Lac's silent pain. In that moment, everything begins to change, but the baby's life still hangs by a fragile thread.